lo, le, se. Direct and indirect object pronouns in Spanish. They can be tricky, but I promise you that by the end of this video, you will know how to confidently use them so you can impress people with your Spanish skills. If you'd like to learn more Spanish from me, make sure to check out my website, SpanishNate.com. Let's get into the video. So, object pronouns, what are they? These are simply little words that replace bigger words. For example, instead of having to always say the book or the computer, we can just say it. Or instead of having to say Bob or Jennifer, we can just say him or her. So we have two kinds of object pronouns, direct and indirect object pronouns. Now, direct object pronouns are directly affected by the verb of the sentence, whereas indirect object pronouns are indirectly affected by the verb of the sentence. For our direct object pronouns, we have me, te, lo, and la, nos, los, and las. Now, here's a pro tip for you. Whenever you hear the word lo, we are almost always talking about an object, not a person. Now, there are situations in which we are talking about a person. However, 90% of the time, when you hear the word lo, it just means it, and we are talking about an object. And 95% of the time, when you hear the word le or les, that is referring to people. Okay, these are really important to remember. If you can just remember those as a general rule of thumb, it's going to help you so much during conversations. Lo is for an object, le and les are for people. Now, it's not always the case. However, 95% of the time, it is. So let's take a look at direct object pronouns. For example, we have llamaron a mi mamá. They called my mom. Or la llamaron. La llamaron. La representing her. Now, when it comes to object pronouns, we always put them before the conjugated verb in the sentence. That is very important. So you cannot say llamaron la. You have to say la llamaron. Now, we have a few exceptions to this rule. However, just remember, the indirect or direct object pronoun always goes before the conjugated verb. Now, the reason that in this sentence we'll be using la instead of le is because mi mamá is the only person or object in the sentence. The thing is that in Spanish, many times we have many different objects in one sentence, which is why I say lo and la typically represent inanimate objects, whereas le and les represent people. However, in this specific example, because mi mamá is the only object in the sentence, we can use la because she is directly receiving the action of the verb llamaron. Now let's take a look at an example with objects. Sara tiró la pelota. Sara la tiró. Tirar is the verb, meaning to throw, and la pelota is the direct object because it is directly receiving the action of tirar. Okay, how about the sentence? Los niños leen los libros. Los niños los leen. Okay, the books are directly receiving the action of reading, so they are the direct object of the sentence. Therefore, we turn them into the direct object pronoun, which should be los, according to our rule. Remember, it's me, te, lo, la, nos, los, and las. Study those charts. Those are seriously so helpful. Amazing. Now you know how to use direct object pronouns. Congratulations. Let's take a look at indirect object pronouns now. Our indirect object pronouns are me, te, le, nos, and les. Now, notice how in the direct and indirect object pronouns, me, te, and nos are all the same. However, notice how le and les have no gender. So le can refer to a masculine thing or a feminine thing. So that is why when we use indirect object pronouns, context is very, very important. Like I said, study these charts. They're going to help you so much. Okay, so an example. Gabriel le compró una rosa a Anita. Gabriel le compró una rosa a Anita. Okay, so comprar is the verb and una rosa is the direct object of the sentence because it's directly receiving the verb of comprar. However, Anita is being indirectly affected by this and therefore she is considered the indirect object. Now, remember, we can turn Anita into an indirect object pronoun so that I don't have to keep saying Anita, Anita, Anita. I can just say le. So I don't have to say, Gabriel le compró una rosa a Anita. I can just say, Gabriel le compró una rosa. Gabriel bought her a rose. Now, like I said, when we're using a word like le or les, we oftentimes need extra context, because if you don't have any context, you can't just randomly use le because we won't know who you're talking about. That's why we can say something like a Anita. Now, we have this idea in Spanish of the redundant le. The idea here is that we put on the le even when we add the a Anita to the end. The idea here is that we can cut off the a Anita and we can just say, Gabriel le compró una rosa. Now, you may have seen that really tiny word se, which can be very confusing because not only is it used as an indirect object pronoun, but it can be used as other things like the passive and impersonal se. But here's the idea. In Spanish, you cannot have Lilo and Stitch. That's what I always tell my students. You cannot have Lilo and Stitch. So you cannot have Lelo or Lelas or Leslo. You cannot have that. In Spanish, le and les become se when we combine them with another direct object pronoun. So in this example, Gabriel le compró una rosa. Now we can turn una rosa into the direct object pronoun, which would be la. So we would have Gabriel se la compró. So he bought it for her. So notice now we've taken Anita and turned her into a pronoun, and we've taken una rosa and also turned it into a pronoun. This can get a little bit hairy and it's quite confusing for many students. So don't worry if you're struggling with this. I recommend that if you're having issues with this, try to just use one object pronoun and then a regular object. So in this case, Gabriel le compró una rosa. We don't need to turn una rosa into an object pronoun. However, that can really shorten up our sentence. Another example would be, Samuel le tiró la pelota a Juan. Samuel le tiró la pelota a Juan. Now, once again, I don't need to add a Juan on the end. I'm just doing it to provide extra context, because if I had just said Samuel le tiró una pelota, then if you don't have any extra context, you might not know who I'm talking about. You might think I'm saying him or her or it. That is why context is so important when using object pronouns. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit difficult, but how would we put the pronouns together? Something I forgot to mention is that we always put the indirect object pronoun before the direct object pronoun, okay? So you cannot have lo, le, for example. Okay, so in this sense, if we want to combine the pronouns, so now we have two pronouns, instead of just Samuel le tiró la pelota, now we would have Samuel se la tiró. Remember, you cannot have Lilo and Stitch. Samuel se la tiró. It's a weird rule in Spanish, but the only reason we do this is because sometimes it sounds a bit clunky to say leslo, for example. Leslo, lelo, leslas, things like that. It sounds more clean to just say selo, sela, for example. Okay, so now let's take a deeper look at direct and indirect object pronouns being used together. So remember, they are the exact same when it comes to me, te, and nos. Where they change is in the lo, la, los, las, and the le and les. Now, do you remember how I said that we always need to put the direct or indirect object pronouns before conjugated verbs in sentences? Well, that is always true. However, we also have a few other options. Mi madre me está comprando una pizza. Mi madre me está comprando una pizza. We can also say, mi madre está comprándome una pizza. So when it comes to the gerund, or the idea of the ing, the present progressive, we can attach our object pronoun onto the end. So you can do either or. Now, is there a difference? No. They both mean the same thing. However, do not put the object pronoun before the conjugated verb and attach it. It's either one or the other. So, mi madre me está comprando una pizza, or mi madre está comprándome una pizza. Okay, so remember how we can use object pronouns together? We could also say, mi madre está comprándomela. Okay? Me representing me and la representing la pizza. I know this is a lot of information, but I promise you that if you really study these and get these down, your Spanish is going to be massively upgraded. Another situation in which we don't need to put the object pronoun before the conjugated verb is with commands. Now, commands are probably the only exception to this. Dame el control remoto. Dame el control remoto. Okay, so I'm saying dame, give me. Now, in Mexico, it's very common that we put the object pronoun before and we would say something like me da el control remoto. Now, the reason we do this is because it sounds even more polite. It's an even more polite way to command someone to do something. It's kind of more passive. However, when it comes to commands, the reason that we attach the object pronoun onto the end of the command is because if I were to just say me da el control remoto out of context, it might sound like I'm saying he gives me the remote control, or she gives me the remote control, which is why with commands, we'll attach the object pronouns onto the command. So we can say dame el control remoto, or we can turn el control remoto into lo, because I don't want to have to keep saying el control remoto. It's kind of a lot. So I can just say dámelo. And you may have heard a Mexican abuelita say to you, cómetelo, commanding you, and those are just object pronouns. One final example here is no quiero decirte la verdad. We can attach the object pronoun onto the infinitive verb, which in this case would be decir. However, if you are not sure, the easiest rule of thumb is to always attach the object pronouns before the conjugated verb. Always place them before the conjugated verb. So in this case, we could say no te quiero decir la verdad, and that also works. Now, we can play with these as well. We can say no te la quiero decir, or no quiero decírtela. Well, I know this has been a lot of information. Feel free to review this video and have a lot more resources on how to use object pronouns on my website, SpanishNate.com, so check it out. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave me a comment on this video. If you feel like I skipped over something, please let me know. You can also send me an email at support@SpanishNate.com. Muchas gracias, que tengas muy buen día. Hasta luego.